I can't take it, just do it, deeper. And the rancher did the unthinkable. Ethan Cole woke up just as the first light of dawn touched the edges of the sky. The air was crisp and smelled faintly of dew and earth. He rubbed his tired eyes, listening to the soft lowing of the cows and the distant crow of a rooster. The ranch had been in his family for 3 generations, and every morning for as long as he could remember, he had woken to the same sounds, the same routines, and the same responsibilities. He had a life built on hard work, on long days and even longer nights, and he carried it all with a quiet determination that few understood. The farmhouse was simple, sturdy, and a little worn, much like Ethan himself. The wooden floors creaked under his boots as he walked to the kitchen, where he brewed a strong cup of coffee and watched the sun slowly rise over the hills. The ranch sprawled out before him, fields stretching as far as the eye could see, dotted with livestock and dotted with reminders of the past. An old windmill, a broken fence post, the rusted frame of a hay wagon that had seen better days. Every piece of the land told a story, and every story reminded Ethan why he refused to leave, even when life had grown hard. It had not been an easy year. The drought had been worse than anyone in the county could remember. Streams that once ran clear and cool were now shallow and murky. Grass that used to blanket the pastures in green had turned brittle and brown. The cows, loyal and patient, had begun to grow thin, and each morning Ethan checked on them with a mixture of hope and worry.
He knew that every decision mattered. One wrong move could cost the ranch more than money. It could cost the life he had built here, the life his father and grandfather had built before him.
Despite the challenges, Ethan's routine never wavered. He rose early, fed the animals, checked fences, and inspected equipment. He repaired what needed repair, mended what was broken, and prayed silently that the land would somehow survive as he had survived through storms and hardship before. The work was endless, and yet there was a strange peace in it. His hands were calloused, his back sore, but his mind was clear. The ranch was demanding, yes, but it gave him a purpose, a reason to face each day with determination. Ethan had learned from a young age that life on the ranch was not about shortcuts. There were no easy solutions when dealing with the land, with the weather, or with livestock. He had watched his father rise before dawn to mend a broken fence, to save a trapped calf, to fix a broken tractor in the middle of a storm. That perseverance had been instilled in him. He believed that problems were meant to be faced, not ignored, and that challenges could be overcome with patience, effort, and a clear mind. Still, even the strongest determination could be tested. This year, however, the challenges had grown heavier. The drought had persisted, and Ethan's savings were dwindling. Crops had failed, feed was scarce, and the market for livestock had dropped. The county had been hit hard, and neighbors who once shared laughter and stories now shared news of losses, debts, and uncertainty. Ethan listened to them, nodded politely, but he never admitted how deeply the worry had settled in his chest. He had learned to carry burdens silently, to endure without complaint, and to hope that somehow things would improve. As he walked through the fields, Ethan noticed the cracked earth beneath his boots. He paused to run his hand over the soil, feeling the dryness, the brittleness, and the stubbornness of the land. He sighed, knowing that each day brought new challenges, new decisions, and new risks. The ranch demanded constant attention, and every mistake could have consequences that were difficult to repair. Still, he pressed forward, moving from task to task with steady determination, speaking softly to his animals, encouraging them as if they understood the weight he carried. His neighbors often remarked on his resilience. Some said he was stubborn, refusing to give up even when the odds were against him. Others admired his courage, his ability to continue when others would have surrendered. Britannia. Ethan, however, rarely thought about what others thought of him. His focus was on the ranch, on the animals, and on the life he had chosen. Pride played a role, Yes, but so did a deep sense of responsibility. The land had been entrusted to him, and he would not abandon it, no matter the cost. Each evening, after the work of the day was done, Ethan would sit on the porch with a cold glass of water, watching the sky turn orange, pink, and purple. The horizon seemed endless, and the stillness of the evening brought a rare calm. He thought of the past, of his father teaching him how to mend fences, how to care for the cattle, how to endure hardship without losing hope. Those lessons had shaped him, forming a quiet strength that few noticed, but that he carried with him everywhere. He thought of his grandfather, who had started the ranch with nothing but determination and sweat, and he felt a deep connection to those who had come before him. Despite his strength, Ethan was not without worry. Each night he considered the challenges of the next day, wondering if he had the resources, the strength, and the luck to face them. He worried about the animals, about the land, and about the future. The drought had tested him in ways he had never imagined, and yet he could not bring himself to give up. Giving up meant losing a part of himself, a part of his history, and a part of the future he hoped to leave for those who came after him. Ethan's life was not just about work. There were small joys, quiet moments that reminded him why he endured. The laughter of children visiting the ranch, the soft nuzzle of a calf seeking comfort, the sight of a wild deer grazing in the distance. All of these brought him small, fleeting moments of happiness. Breath of breath. He treasured them, knowing that they were the reason for his persistence, the reason for his silent determination. Life on the ranch was harsh, but it was also full of beauty, and Ethan carried both in equal measure. But as the weeks passed, the pressures grew. The weather remained unforgiving. Supplies were limited, and Ethan faced difficult decisions about how to manage his resources. Each day was a balancing act, a careful calculation of what could be done, what could be postponed, and what could not be ignored. The ranch demanded his full attention, his full effort, and his full heart. There was no room for error, and yet he pressed forward, guided by a mixture of experience, intuition, and hope. Ethan's connection to the land was more than practical. It was emotional. He felt the rhythm of the seasons, the pulse of the soil, and the quiet life of the animals. He understood that the ranch was more than a source of income. It was a living entity, one that required care, respect, and patience. He often spoke to the land in quiet whispers, promising that he would do his best, that he would endure, and that he would honor the generations who had come before him. Even in the quiet moments, Ethan never truly rested. The ranch was always on his mind, the responsibilities always at the forefront. He calculated, planned, and prepared for whatever challenges might come. Desperate neighbors read about new techniques and adapted old methods to fit the changing world. Every decision mattered, every action had consequences, and he bore the weight of those responsibilities with silent courage. Despite the hardship, Ethan remained hopeful. He believed that perseverance, patience, and careful planning could carry him through even the toughest times. He had faced storms, droughts, and setbacks before, and he had always found a way forward. This resilience was not born of luck, but of determination, knowledge, and an unwavering sense of duty. He knew that the path ahead would be difficult, but he was willing to face it, day after day, step by step, without complaint. The ranch, in all its beauty and hardship, was Ethan's world. It shaped him, challenged him, and defined him. Every sunrise, every sunset, every long day of work, and every quiet night of reflection reinforced the bond he had with the land. He knew that the life he had chosen was not easy, but it was meaningful. It was a life of responsibility, perseverance, and connection. To the land, to the animals, and to the generations who had come before, and those who would come after. Ethan Cole's mornings, his work, and his evenings formed a rhythm that was both exhausting and grounding. The weight of responsibility pressed on him, yet it also gave him purpose. He understood that true strength was not in avoiding hardship, but in facing it with courage, with wisdom, and with a steadfast heart. And so he continued, step by step, day by day, knowing that this life, with all its challenges, was the life he had chosen, the life he would endure, and the life he would honor. The days grew hotter and the sky seemed to stretch endlessly above the ranch. The sun beat down on the cracked earth, baking the fields and casting long shadows from the wooden fence posts. Ethan Cole moved through his land with the same careful attention as always, but there was a tension in his steps now, a worry he could not shake. The drought had grown worse. The small creek that had once cut through the property was now a thin trickle, and the cattle had begun to gather near the last remaining puddles, waiting for water that would not come. Ethan's heart tightened every time he saw them huddled together, thirsty and confused, not understanding why the land that had always fed them now seemed to fail. He had tried everything he could think of. Early in the morning he carried buckets of water to the animals, moving from pasture to pasture, his arms straining under the weight. He dug new channels to try to guide the little water they had to the areas that needed it most. Rationed feed carefully, stretching every bale, every handful, and every bit of hay as far as he could. Still, it never seemed enough. The reality of the situation pressed down on him like the sun above, relentless and unyielding. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt the true weight of helplessness.
Neighbors came by from time to time, offering advice, sharing what little they could spare, or simply stopping to speak a word of encouragement. Some suggested selling part of the ranch to buy water or feed.
Others warned him that the animals might not survive the season if something wasn't done immediately. Ethan listened politely to each suggestion, but inside he felt a rising panic. Selling land was unthinkable. The ranch was more than property. It was history, life, and identity. To give up even a piece of it felt like erasing a part of himself, of his family, and of the generations who had poured sweat and blood into this place. One morning, as he walked along the fence line checking for breaks or signs of animals wandering too close to danger, Ethan spotted one of the cows limping slightly. He rushed over, his boots kicking up dust, and knelt beside it. The animal's leg was scraped and raw, likely from trying to find water where none existed. Ethan's hands were gentle as he cleaned the wound and wrapped it as best he could. He whispered to the cow softly, words he didn't even think he meant to say, a prayer of hope that somehow things would get better.
I know. Just hold on a little longer," he murmured.
Even as he tended to the animals, the thought of the land failing, of everything he had worked for slipping away, gnawed at him. By mid-afternoon, the heat was almost unbearable. Ethan climbed onto his tractor to check the upper fields, scanning the horizon for any sign of life or hope. Dust swirled in the air, shimmering in the sunlight, and the distant hills seemed far away, unreachable. He felt the isolation of the ranch keenly in those moments, a weight that pressed on him as much as the drought itself. He had always been proud of his independence, of his ability to manage this land with his own hands, but now that independence felt fragile, like the thin straw he had been clinging to for survival. Word of the drought's severity had spread throughout the county. Other ranchers and farmers were struggling, and some had already made the difficult choice to sell land or move away. Ethan saw their results: fields left barren, livestock sold off, fences abandoned, and he felt a deep sense of dread. Yet stubborn as ever, he refused to let go. He could not imagine walking away from the land, from the ranch that had survived storms, floods, and fire. Giving up was not an option, even if it meant risking everything he owned. That afternoon, his longtime neighbor Carl stopped by. Carl was older, grizzled, with hands as worn as Ethan's, but his eyes carried a sharp wisdom earned from decades on the land.
"Ethan," he said, shading his eyes from the sun, "I don't like saying this, but you need to think carefully."
The creek isn't coming back this year, and the feed won't last. You need to plan, maybe even sell some stock, or... Carl hesitated, clearly reluctant to finish. Ethan interrupted gently but firmly. I can't, Carl. Not yet. Not while there's a chance to save this. The words were steady, but inside, Ethan felt the creeping fear that maybe, just maybe, he had already waited too long. Evenings brought little relief. The heat remained, settling into the land and into Ethan's bones. He sat on the porch, listening to the distant lowing of the cows and the occasional sigh of the wind through the dry grass. He tried to rest, but sleep came in short bursts, filled with images of dry fields, weak animals, and his father's disappointed face. The weight of responsibility never left him. The ranch was more than a livelihood. It was a promise he had made, a duty he could not shirk, and the thought of failing it was unbearable. As the days went on, the pressure mounted. Ethan noticed signs of strain among the cattle. Some refused to eat, others wandered aimlessly, and a few began to show signs of illness. He called the vet, explaining the situation and asking for advice. The vet's voice, calm but serious, outlined options, some expensive, some risky. Ethan nodded, absorbing every word, and then quietly placed the phone down. The solutions were either unaffordable or impractical, and the clock was ticking. The realization hit him like a punch to the chest. If he did nothing, the ranch might not survive, and if he acted incorrectly, he could make matters worse. One afternoon, as Ethan inspected a distant pasture, he noticed something alarming. A small section of fencing had collapsed, leaving several young cows dangerously close to a steep embankment. Without hesitation, he ran to secure the animals, climbing over broken rails and tying ropes with skill born of years of experience. The adrenaline pumped through him, but the fear lingered. The land was failing in ways even he could not fully control. Every day brought a new crisis, and every decision felt heavier than the last. He was no longer just a rancher. He was a man fighting for survival against forces beyond his control. It was during these moments that the pressure became almost unbearable. Ethan had always been strong, always relied on his own judgment, and always pushed forward. But now, with each passing day, the challenges seemed to multiply. His muscles ached from work. His mind raced with calculations and worst-case scenarios, and his heart grew heavier with each animal that suffered, or each patch of land that refused to yield. He knew that he could not allow despair to take hold, yet he felt the creeping shadows of doubt, fear, and exhaustion pressing against him. One night after a particularly long day, Ethan stood on a hill overlooking the ranch. The moon hung low and bright, casting silver light across the fields. He felt the weight of generations on his shoulders, the faces of his father and grandfather in his mind, and he whispered a silent vow to continue. I won't give up, he told the wind. I can't give up. Not now. Not ever. The words carried strength, but they also carried the tension that had been building for weeks. The knowledge that he faced a moment where no easy choices remained. Soon Ethan realized that he might need to take a risk unlike any he had taken before. The water shortage could not wait, and waiting would only make matters worse. He spent hours considering options, weighing consequences, and imagining outcomes. The ranch demanded action, and time was slipping away. Every path seemed dangerous, yet doing nothing was no longer an option. He had reached a point where courage and desperation intertwined, where choices were measured not just by wisdom but by the sheer need to survive. By the following morning, Ethan had made his decision. He would act to save the ranch, no matter the risk. The equipment was old, the work grueling, and the task ahead daunting. Yet he felt a strange clarity in that moment, a quiet resolve that pushed aside fear and uncertainty. He could not allow the land to fail, the animals to suffer, or the family legacy to end. The weight of responsibility had pushed him to the edge, but it had also given him the determination to keep going, to do whatever it took to protect everything he loved. As he moved through the fields preparing for the day's work, Ethan reflected on the weeks behind him. The long hours, the endless worry, the sleepless nights. He understood that the coming days would test him more than anything before. But for the first time in weeks, he felt a spark of hope amidst the pressure. It was fragile, like a thin line of water in a dry creek bed, but it was enough. Enough to make him move forward, enough to make him fight, and enough to remind him that sometimes survival required daring, persistence, and unwavering courage. The ranch waited quietly as Ethan began preparations. Every animal, every patch of earth, and every tool in his possession became part of a careful plan to face the crisis head-on. The decisions ahead were heavy, and the risks were real, but for Ethan in that moment there was no turning back. He could not. He would not. And so, with the sun climbing higher in the sky, Ethan Cole stepped into the most challenging days of his life, determined to face the drought, the failing land, and the crushing pressure with every ounce of strength he possessed. Ethan Cole stood in the early morning light, staring at the dry, cracked fields that stretched endlessly before him. Every day for weeks had felt like this, relentless, exhausting, and heavy with responsibility. But today felt different. There was a tension inside him that he could no longer ignore, a feeling that the time for careful planning and waiting had passed. The drought had pushed him to the edge, the animals were weak, and the land was failing faster than he could keep up. Something had to be done, even if the solution was risky, even if it went against every warning he had been given. He walked slowly to the barn, the familiar creak of the old wooden doors greeting him like an old friend. The smell of hay and livestock filled the air, a comforting reminder of the life he had built here. Yet, comfort was fleeting. His mind was racing, filled with calculations, possibilities, and fears. The unthinkable plan had formed slowly in his mind over the past few days, growing stronger as options ran out. But he knew the risks. He knew it could fail. But he also knew that doing nothing was no longer an option. Survival demanded action! Ethan began with careful preparation. He gathered tools, inspected the old tractor, checked the pumps, and studied the terrain. Every decision mattered. He measured distances, checked water levels, and planned the work step by step. The task was grueling, more difficult than anything he had done before, but he felt a strange sense of clarity. The unthinkable decision was terrifying, yes, but it was also purposeful. It was the only chance the ranch had to survive, and he could not let fear stop him now. He started early, before the sun had fully risen. The air was cool, but it carried the weight of the day ahead. Ethan worked with methodical care, moving slowly to avoid mistakes. The equipment groaned under the strain of the work, and the dust swirled around him, clinging to his skin and clothes. Sweat ran down his face, mixing with the dirt and grime, but he barely noticed. There was no room for hesitation. Every step had to be precise, every decision deliberate. The ranch depended on him, and he could feel the responsibility in every muscle, every thought, every breath. Hours passed, and the sun climbed higher, burning down on the fields. Ethan's hands were raw from gripping ropes and tools. His back ached from bending and lifting, and his legs trembled with exhaustion. Yet he kept going, driven by the urgency of the situation. Brah! He moved from task to task, securing equipment, redirecting water channels, and reinforcing fences. Each action was small but necessary, a piece of the larger plan that he hoped would save the ranch. Failure was not an option, though he knew deep down that the risks were real. The animals watched him with quiet trust. The cows, the calves, even the few horses that remained, followed his movements. Sensing his determination, they had always relied on him, and now, more than ever, they needed him. Ethan spoke to them softly, words of reassurance and encouragement. "Oh, Oh, just a little longer, he whispered, his voice carrying over the dry fields. It was a strange comfort, talking to the animals as if they could understand his fears, as if they could share his burden. But in those moments, Ethan felt a connection to them stronger than ever before, a silent bond that gave him strength to keep going. As the day wore on, the work became more intense. Ethan had to climb steep embankments, move heavy machinery, and carefully guide water into channels that had long since dried up. Each task was physically demanding and mentally exhausting. He wiped the sweat from his brow, took a quick sip of water, and pressed on. There was no time to rest, no time to second-guess himself. The ranch needed him, and he would not fail. The unthinkable decision he had made required courage, focus, and unwavering determination, and he found each of these qualities within himself as he pushed forward. Midway through the afternoon, a neighbor drove by in a pickup truck. Carl, who had warned him weeks earlier, pulled up slowly and called out,
Ethan!
Are you sure about this? It looks dangerous. Ethan didn't stop.
But he waved, acknowledging Carl, but his attention remained on the task at hand. I have to try, Carl, he shouted back over the roar of the tractor and the pounding of his heart. There's no other choice. Carl watched for a moment, worry etched into his face, and then drove on. Ethan knew he was taking a risk, but he also knew that hesitation could cost him everything. By late afternoon, the work was taking a toll. The sun was high and harsh, beating down relentlessly, and Ethan's energy was fading. His arms ached from gripping ropes and levers, his legs trembled, and his clothes were soaked with sweat and dust. He paused for a moment, leaning on the tractor, and took a deep breath. Doubt crept in. What if it failed? What if the animals suffered despite his efforts? What if the ranch, the life he had built and cherished, was lost? But he pushed the thoughts aside. He had come too far to stop now. The unthinkable decision had been made, and now he had to see it through. As the hours passed, the risk became more tangible. The water channels were precarious, the ground uneven, and the equipment old and strained. Psst. One wrong move could collapse the channels, break the machinery, or injure him. Yet Ethan continued careful and deliberate, guided by experience and instinct. He adjusted the channels, monitored the flow of water, and reinforced weak spots. Every action was calculated, every step purposeful. He felt the weight of responsibility pressing on him, but he also felt a growing determination, a fierce drive to succeed no matter what. By evening, the first signs of progress began to show. Water, clear and steady, started to flow through the newly constructed channels. The animals drank eagerly, their tired eyes brightening, their energy returning. Ethan felt a rush of relief mixed with exhaustion. The unthinkable plan was working, at least for now. He stood on a hill overlooking the fields, watching the water reach areas that had been dry for weeks. It was a small victory, but it was significant. The ranch was not saved yet, but the first steps had been taken, and that was enough to keep him going. Night fell, and the ranch was quiet except for the gentle sounds of flowing water and the low murmurs of the animals. Ethan sat on the porch, hands still rough and dirty, clothes damp and dusty. He sipped cold water, feeling the day's exhaustion settling into his bones. Yet he also felt a quiet pride. He had taken the risk, faced the challenge, and made the unthinkable decision to act when others might have hesitated. The outcome was still uncertain, but he had shown courage and determination, and that mattered. He had faced the crisis head-on, and he had done what needed to be done. Sleep came late that night, heavy and deep. Ethan's dreams were filled with images of flowing water, green fields, and thriving animals. The pressure of the day had left him physically drained, but mentally and emotionally he felt a strange satisfaction. He had acted decisively, faced his fears, and done everything within his power to protect the ranch. The unthinkable decision had been made, and while the consequences were still unknown, he had taken control of the situation instead of letting it control him. The following morning brought more work, more challenges, and more decisions. Ethan moved through the fields with careful attention, checking the channels, reinforcing weak spots, and tending to the animals. Each day was a test of endurance, skill, and patience. Breath. He had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act in spite of it. The unthinkable decision had forced him to confront not only the dangers in the land, but also the doubts within himself. And with each step he grew stronger, more determined, and more confident in his ability to face whatever came next. As the weeks went on, the ranch slowly began to respond. Water reached areas that had been dry for months. The animals regained some strength, and the soil, while still cracked and dry, showed signs of life returning. Ethan continued to work tirelessly, knowing that the battle was far from over, but also understanding that he had taken the right steps. The unthinkable decision had been necessary, and while it had been frightening, it had also been the catalyst for hope. Brask. He had faced the worst of the crisis and had acted with courage, determination, and skill. Through it all, Ethan reflected on what he had learned. By far, what about Tau de Piat Van Ask? Life on the ranch was unpredictable, full of challenges that could not always be controlled. Yet it was also full of opportunities for courage, problem-solving, and resilience. The unthinkable decision had taught him that sometimes the only way forward was to act boldly, even when the risks were high. It had reminded him that responsibility, perseverance, and careful planning were essential, and that fear could be overcome with determination and focus. Ethan knew that more challenges lay ahead, and that the drought was not over.
The success of the unthinkable plan was only the beginning.
Yet he felt ready. He had faced the pressure, made a difficult decision, and seen the first signs of progress. The ranch had survived another test, and Ethan had proven to himself that he could endure, adapt, and act when it mattered most. He was not invincible, and he knew there would be more struggles, but he also knew that he had the courage, skill, and determination to face them. And so, Ethan continued his work, moving from sunrise to sunset, tending to the animals, reinforcing the land, and ensuring that the water flowed where it was needed. Each day was still hard, each decision still carried weight, but he had faced the unthinkable and come through stronger. The ranch was alive, the animals were surviving, and Ethan's resolve had never been greater. He had stepped into the unknown, taken the risk, and emerged with a renewed sense of purpose and hope. The unthinkable decision had changed him, strengthened him, and given him the tools to face whatever the future held. The days that followed Ethan's daring actions were filled with a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and uncertainty. The water flowed into the fields more steadily now, and the animals were beginning to regain some of their strength. The pasture, while still dry in places, showed faint hints of green returning. Ethan moved through the ranch each morning with a cautious optimism, watching the changes he had wrought. He knew better than to celebrate too soon. Nature was unpredictable, and the drought was far from over. But for the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of hope that had been almost impossible to find. The work continued to be grueling. Ethan rose before sunrise, as he always had, carrying buckets, checking channels, repairing fences, and tending to the livestock. His hands were sore, his back ached, and his legs trembled from the effort. But the results were undeniable. The water flowed where it needed to. The animals drank eagerly, and the soil, stubborn and cracked, began to soak in life-giving moisture.
Each small victory felt monumental, and Ethan allowed himself to recognize the progress he had made.
Breath. It was a delicate balance, however. He knew that a single mistake could undo weeks of effort, and so he pressed on with unwavering focus. Neighbors continued to visit, some curious, some concerned, and some simply wanting to witness the results of his daring plan. Carl, the longtime neighbor who had warned him weeks earlier, stopped by again one afternoon. Briss. He leaned against his truck, shading his eyes from the sun, and watched Ethan work. "I have to hand it to you, Ethan," he said quietly. "I wasn't sure you'd pull it off." Ethan paused, wiping sweat from his brow. "Neither was I," he admitted. "But we had no other choice." Carl nodded, a mixture of respect and concern in his eyes. The moment was brief, but it reminded Ethan that his choices were not just about survival. They were about proving to himself and others that perseverance and courage could make a difference. Despite the progress, Ethan could not ignore the toll the past weeks had taken on him. Sleep was still difficult to come by, and when he did rest, his dreams were haunted by images of thirsty animals, cracked soil, and failed plans. Each morning he forced himself out of bed, knowing that the ranch needed him more than he needed rest. The emotional burden was heavy, but it was one he carried willingly. He had made the unthinkable decision, and now he had to live with the consequences, both the successes and the lingering risks. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Ethan walked through the fields, observing the subtle changes that his efforts had brought. Small patches of green clung stubbornly to the earth, evidence that water had reached the roots and life was returning. The animals moved with a little more energy, their steps less hesitant. Ethan knelt beside a young calf, running his hand over its soft coat and smiling faintly. "We made it this far," he whispered, more to himself than to the animal. There was pride in his voice, but also a quiet humility. He knew that the work was not over, and that survival required continued care, effort, and attention. Word of Ethan's efforts spread throughout the county. Other ranchers and farmers came to see the results of his actions, curious about the methods he had employed and the risks he had taken. Some shook their heads, warning him that the drought was far from over, and that future challenges could be even more severe. Others expressed admiration, acknowledging that his courage, determination, and skill had allowed him to protect his land and livestock against almost impossible odds.
Ethan listened politely to all of it, but he remained focused on the ranch itself.
Recognition was secondary. The land, the animals, and the legacy of his family were his true concerns. As the days passed, Ethan began to reflect more deeply on what he had learned. Life on the ranch was unpredictable, and no amount of planning could prevent every hardship. The drought had tested his strength, his judgment, and his endurance in ways he had never imagined. Yet it had also taught him lessons about resilience, problem-solving, and the importance of acting decisively when circumstances demanded it. He realized that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to face fear with determination and thoughtfulness. The unthinkable decision he had made was not reckless. It was born of necessity, guided by experience, and executed with care. Ethan also reflected on his relationship with the land itself. The ranch was more than property. It was living, breathing, and demanding. It required attention, patience, and respect. The drought had revealed its fragility, but also its resilience. By taking action, he had reinforced the bond he shared with the land. Every channel dug, every fence reinforced, and every animal tended was an affirmation of that connection. The land had responded to his efforts, and in return, it had given him a renewed sense of purpose and hope. Family and community remained important anchors during this time. Though Ethan often worked alone, he thought of the generations who had come before him, the lessons his father had taught, and the sacrifices his grandfather had made to build the ranch. Their presence, though not physical, was constant in his mind. He drew strength from their memory and their example, knowing that perseverance, integrity, and care were the qualities that had sustained them through their own hardships. The unthinkable decision he had made was, in a sense, a continuation of their legacy, a testament to the values that had guided his family for generations. Ethan also considered the future. The drought might end, or it might persist, and new challenges could arise at any time.
He understood that survival was not guaranteed, and that vigilance, preparation, and continued effort would always be necessary.
Burst. Yet he felt more confident now, knowing that he had faced the worst of the crisis and taken decisive action. The unthinkable decision had strengthened him, both as a rancher and as a person. It had taught him that while life on the ranch was never easy, it was possible to overcome obstacles with determination, courage, and careful planning. One afternoon, as Ethan rested briefly under the shade of an old oak tree, he watched the sun move slowly across the sky. The air was warm but not oppressive, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of earth, grass, and the faint aroma of hay. He listened to the soft murmur of water in the channels he had constructed, and the lowing of the cattle as they grazed and drank. A sense of calm settled over him, rare and welcome after weeks of tension and uncertainty. In that moment, he understood that the unthinkable decision had not only saved his ranch, but had also reaffirmed his connection to the land, to the animals, and to his own sense of purpose. The next morning brought more work, but also more confidence. Ethan moved through the fields efficiently, checking the water flow, reinforcing weak spots, and tending to the animals with careful attention. The routine was familiar, but the context had changed. What had once felt like an impossible burden now felt like a manageable challenge. The unthinkable decision had shifted the balance, creating an opportunity where none seemed to exist before. Breath. Ethan felt a renewed sense of determination, knowing that while the work was far from over, he had taken control of the situation, instead of letting it control him. Over the weeks, the ranch slowly returned to a more stable state. The fields, while not fully recovered, began to show signs of life. The animals regained strength and vitality. Ethan's careful attention and unyielding effort had paid off, though he knew that continued care was essential. The crisis had not vanished, but the immediate danger had passed. He had faced the unthinkable, taken a risk when circumstances demanded it, and emerged with both lessons learned and tangible results. Through the experience, Ethan also gained a deeper understanding of himself. He realized that his strength was not merely physical or technical, but also emotional and mental. He had faced fear, doubt, and immense pressure, and had chosen action over inaction. He had learned that resilience was cultivated through experience, reflection, and the willingness to take responsibility. The unthinkable decision had tested every aspect of his character, and he had emerged with a renewed sense of confidence and self-respect. Ethan also understood the importance of balance. While determination and courage had carried him through the crisis, he knew that future challenges would require careful planning, collaboration, and sometimes seeking advice from others. The experience had shown him that survival was not about acting alone, but about using knowledge, skill, and intuition together. The unthinkable decision had been necessary, but it had also highlighted the value of preparation, observation, and patience. As the sun set on another long day, Ethan walked through the fields once more. The air was cool, the sky painted in shades of orange, pink, and purple. The animals moved steadily across the pasture, drinking and grazing in relative comfort. The channels of water he had worked tirelessly to create flowed smoothly, carrying life to the land and hope to its caretaker. Ethan paused to take in the scene, feeling a quiet pride, a sense of accomplishment, and a deep connection to everything around him. He thought of the weeks of struggle, the hours of grueling work, and the moments of doubt and fear. He reflected on the unthinkable decision that had pushed him to his limits, and the courage and determination that had allowed him to persevere. The crisis had tested him, but it had also taught him invaluable lessons about responsibility, resilience, and the importance of facing challenges with both courage and wisdom. Ethan knew that life on the ranch would never be easy. There would always be new obstacles, new risks, and new moments that demanded his full attention, yet he felt prepared, confident, and determined to face them. The unthinkable decision had not only saved the ranch, but it had also strengthened him as a person, deepened his connection to the land, and reaffirmed his commitment to the legacy of his family. As night fell and the stars appeared, Ethan sat on the porch, listening to the quiet murmur of the ranch. The world seemed peaceful, and for the first time in a long while, he felt truly at ease. He knew that challenges would continue, but he also knew that he had the strength, experience, and determination to meet them head-on. The unthinkable decision had been a turning point, a moment that tested him in every way, and yet it had also illuminated the path forward. In the stillness of the night, Ethan Cole understood the true meaning of perseverance, courage, and responsibility. The ranch had survived, the animals had survived, and he had survived. And though the future was uncertain, he knew that he would face it with the same steadfast determination that had guided him through the hardest days of his life. The unthinkable decision had taught him that sometimes survival required bold action, careful thought, and unwavering resolve, and that true strength came not from avoiding challenges, but from meeting them head-on